I have no idea exactly what year this story is. Again, I say you can just look them up, and it's right there. But I remember maybe it was like 97 or 8. Maybe it was 99. I don't remember. But again, you'll be able to go back. So I was in Seattle, and back then you would just buy all of the music mags that you could, or anything that you could get, because it was a 4.5 hour flight from Seattle to Detroit. 4.5 hour flight from Seattle to Detroit. So I think it was the Vibe magazine. I want to say Vibe magazine, and I picked it up. And I remember it was a night flight. So like I just remember being night, and I just got it. And back then, that was what you had. You had a Vibe magazine. You had to make all the stories up, make them bigger than they were just reading them, because that's all you had. You read it again. So the interview then was, well, shit, maybe it was after 2000. I feel like this is after 2000 now that I'm thinking about it, pretty much. But so I get on this plane and I start reading this Vibe magazine. And the interview is with Scarface. Scarface had just taken over Def Jam South, I believe, with Jay-Z's blessing. That's what I gather. Okay? So the article was about Brad sitting there talking to Vibe and talking about his new position at Def Jam South. So they were sitting there talking to him, and he was like, "Let me go through Billboard. Let me show you guys what numbers look like for me looking at artists." I'm reading like mad. This is crazy, So, yeah, it was weird for Scarface to be heading up Def Jam South. Yeah, but not like, it's not like he thought he couldn't do it. It's just like, it was weird that he would take that on. So just like it was weird for Jay-Z to take on Def Jam position. So Scarface is talking about looking at all of the numbers from the sound scans back then, and looking at all of the artists at that time who were hot all around the country. So one thing about like me growing up with the hip hop is like I always knew who was advertising and what magazines, and all of you had to read the fine print, but like if you did, then you were into like MJG and A-Ball and the Swap House and all of that. That was just kind of like, those guys weren't really to the media like interested enough to feature. But of course those guys, Tony Draper and all of those guys, were advertising like crazy. So you wanted to know who those guys were. So like again, that to me, that was like the fine print. So these guys were advertising like crazy. Really, just what made all that South like different, and the Bay and LA. I would say the Bay is just, they just realized the power in media and getting on covers of magazines, and they just were. I'm gonna cut here and go to a story. So in Seattle, when I was putting out my first album, I knew I was gonna be famous, of course, right? So one day though, I go to my mailbox, and I would always read Murder Dogg, so I get it, and I'm looking at it, and these guys have reviewed my first album. They're like Major Weight Media is like some cool shit. You can just kind of like sit back, relax, and you can play it at a family barbecue. That's what they said. So I was like, God damn, that's fucking disrespectful. But the thing about the review is that I hadn't bought any ads. But we did, for some reason. They used one of my songs. They used Maintaining at the Def Jam compilation CDs. Now, I will admit, I paid somebody like $100 to do that, but it was in a parking lot of a mall. I would have never thought I would get that money back, and that's what promoting was like back in the mid-90s. That was a big deal for me to be featured in Murder Dogg magazine. Again, I thought I would be super famous, but I had an understanding a little bit of what it was like to try to like be on the national scale. Even though things were really divided. But I digress. So let's go back. So I'm on this plane and I'm reading the story about Scarface, who is the head of Def Jam, and he's going through all of the cities and their numbers and what people are doing. And you go, okay, we have our eye on this artist, okay? And he goes, this artist has been grinding on the grassroots level forever. Okay, well, like back then you could probably put that into like 12 people. So he says, let's look at his numbers across the United States. So you go, okay, he was a Southern artist too. He was a Southern artist, and he had been out for a long time, and he had advertised like crazy, and his advertising was genius. Maybe you can guess who this was. I'm thinking it was 90-ish. So Scarface says, well, we look at this guy's numbers and we go, okay, look, man, he's doing this many units up in New York. He sold this many CDs is how that would go. He sold, like, let's just say back at that time, it was like he sold 18,000 units, in Texas. And say he sold like 7,000 units in New York. And say he sold like, just kind of going down the thing. Say he sold like 12,000 in Atlanta. So you're like, who is this guy? And then he start going around. He goes, oh, and this guy, speaking about who he's looking at, he goes, this guy's even, moving numbers in California, and he's a Southern artist. So like, okay, so of course, he's got the eye of the bigwig. And then he goes, and then let's go to the Northwest. Okay, that's what he said. And he goes, let's look at this guy's numbers in Seattle. And he goes, this guy's got not even 1,000 CDs sold in Seattle. And he goes, and that's why we don't look at Seattle as being part of the music business. Now, maybe his exact numbers is that's why we look at Seattle, it doesn't count. So what he said was Portland was the first city in the Northwest that any music people even look at. Now, that was an eye-opener for me. The artist, if you can guess, was Lil Flip. And he had already had Game Over. Like, he had already had Game Over. So then he starts kind of getting the eye of Def Jam South. So that's how that happened. But to me, that story, he said we only pay attention to Portland because in the South, in the Northwest, nobody sells shit. He said nobody moves numbers. So he goes, so we look at Portland, and he's like, okay, look, they got 2,500 CDs sold. Like that's all that we count. We don't even look at Seattle. Now I rewind back to one more thing that I always have to reference to Seattle is this. Like being kind of like in Seattle and Detroit and stuff growing up, I always saw that there was a huge difference in the kind of concerts that would come to Seattle as opposed to the ones that would come to Detroit. For example, like the Kings of Comedy tour toured for a bunch of years, I guess. I mean, not I guess, but for a few years at least, before the special was made. And I remember being in Seattle when they came, and Steve Harvey walks out on the stage and he says, "It's good to be in Seattle. This is the only time the Kings of Comedy ever came to Seattle, right? This one time." And he goes, "It's good to be part in Seattle, And he goes, we don't get a chance to come here very often because you guys are a B market." He said to the audience who was booing at this time, "Don't blame me. Y'all is the B market." That tells you a lot about the relationship with the entertainment business in Seattle. And before I moved to Seattle in '88, I already knew Mix-a-Lot, Posse on Broadway, from being in Detroit. And I had a friend in Chicago, and I think that they used to say, like, my posse's on 5 Tray in Chicago. Like, the DJs would just, like, mute that part on the song, and then they would pump locally whoever they were. So I loved Mix-a-Lot when I was in Detroit. Then I moved there in '88, and my bus route is basically the music video for Posse's on Broadway, and it's depressing as fuck. It's like what the fuck, man? This is crazy. And I always like it was crazy because when I would be in Seattle, I felt the confidence of like my Detroit friends being behind me, and when I was in Detroit, I felt the confidence of like, yo, I'll bring some of my Seattle cats out here, don't know any difference. And so that's kind of how I always like looked at the two. But yeah, that's kind of the story. And you know, in the 90s, yeah, I fought every media outlet there was, right? So we'll take that up. But anyway, that story with him, it always struck me, and I kind of felt like at that point that it really, everything needed to be said. The reason why I felt like you had no hope in Seattle doing hip hop is because there was no hope in Seattle doing hip hop.